Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating academic paper that breaks down the complex, on-the-ground realities of the UK housing and homelessness crisis. We're going to look at exactly why current laws are struggling so much, and then explore what policy lessons we can actually learn from the international case studies mentioned in the research. If you want to understand the structural machinery operating behind the scenes of this crisis, you are in the exact right place.
But before we get deep into the policy weeds, we really need to ground ourselves in the human reality of this issue. Just take a second and think about this number, 45. According to data highlighted in the paper from Crisis UK and the Office for National Statistics, the average age of death for a homeless man in the UK is just 45 years old. For women, it's tragically even lower, at 43. We're not just talking about lacking a roof here. This represents extreme social exclusion and danger. The premature mortality we're seeing is a brutal reminder of why getting social policy right is, quite literally, a matter of life and death.
So, to figure out how to fix this, we first need to understand the true scale of the problem. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the visible and hidden crisis. When most of us think of homelessness, we immediately picture rough sleeping, and the statistics the paper outlines here are absolutely staggering. Based on a single-night snapshot approach used in England, rough sleeping is up 164% since 2010. The demographic profile is predominantly male, over 26, and UK nationals. And the daily reality for these folks? It's brutal. The research notes that individuals in this population are 17 times more likely to experience violence and a heartbreaking 9 times more likely to take their own lives compared to the general public. But as shocking as that 164% increase is, rough sleeping is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. What's super interesting is how this research redefines our entire understanding of the crisis. The paper introduces this concept called core homelessness. It's a comprehensive measure that captures over 242,000 households. This brings the hidden, invisible crisis into the light. People who aren't necessarily out on the streets, but are sofa surfing, living in unconventional setups like sheds or garages, or just trapped in bed and breakfast for months on end. For every visible rough sleeper you walk past, there are dozens of households living in these incredibly precarious, insecure conditions. And this leads right into where a massive chunk of that hidden population ends up: the temporary accommodation system. Back in 2010, there were roughly 48,000 households in the system. By early 2024, that jumped to over 117,000. And by 2025, it hit a staggering 132,410 households. To put that into perspective, this is a system that has nearly tripled its load in just 15 years. London takes the absolute brunt of this, but arguably the most heartbreaking statistic in the source material is that over 151,000 children were living in this highly unstable temporary system as of early 2024. Okay, so with a crisis of this sheer magnitude, how exactly has the government responded? That brings us to Section 2, the Homelessness Reduction Act. Back in 2017, the UK government rolled out the Homelessness Reduction Act, or the HRA. The paper actually flags this as the most significant shift in homelessness policy in 4 decades. See, historically, the older 1996 Housing Act worked like a really rigid, unforgiving safety net. It only caught people if they passed very specific priority need tests. That meant single rough sleepers were often completely ignored, left with nothing more than a pamphlet and some basic advice. The HRA 2017, which was heavily pushed by campaign groups like Crisis and Shelter, aimed to totally change that by shifting the focus away from last-minute crisis management and moving heavily toward early intervention and prevention. The really crucial part here is how the Act restructured legal responsibilities on the ground. It introduced 2 major new statutory duties for local authorities. First up, the prevention duty. Councils now have 56 days to take reasonable steps to stop homelessness for anyone at risk. Second, the relief duty. If someone is already homeless, the council has 56 days to help secure them accommodation. And here is the massive game changer. These duties apply regardless of whether the person has a so-called priority need. It literally forces local authorities to step in and act much, much earlier. To actually make these duties work, the HRA relies on a few key mechanisms. First, you have personalized housing plans, or PHPs. These are mandatory documents that a housing officer and the applicant have to co-produce, mapping out the realistic steps both sides will take to secure housing. Second, the Act created something called a duty to refer. This is a fascinating policy tweak because it tries to build a cross-governmental safety net. Basically, public bodies, like hospitals, prisons, and social services, are legally required to notify the local housing authority if they spot someone who is at risk of homelessness. It's a deliberate attempt to stop people from falling through the institutional cracks. But despite this really well-intentioned legal framework, the numbers just keep going up. Why? Well, let's dive into Section 3, Structural Barriers and Systemic Failures. While the HRA has definitely increased the visibility of the crisis and helped a lot of people at the prevention stage, it is seriously buckling under the pressure at the relief stage. Get this, only 30.4% of relief duties, meaning the support given to people who have already lost their homes, actually result in securing housing for at least 6 months. That is a remarkably low success rate. And the fundamental reason for this, as the source paper sharply points out, is that passing a law that creates a duty to house someone does not magically build the physical houses required to fulfill that duty. The paper neutrally but very clearly outlines how the HRA is constantly swimming against the tide of broader economic choices. Research analysed in the paper indicates that post-2010 welfare reforms are directly conflicting with homelessness prevention. You've got policies like the bedroom tax and benefit caps running alongside freezes to the local housing allowance that completely fail to keep pace with soaring market rents. The analysis suggests these reforms have essentially removed an estimated £27 billion a year from the economy. So these broader economic realities effectively just cancel out the preventative ambitions of the HRA. Which brings us to a really striking phrase used by critics in the paper. Without addressing the actual supply side, the HRA is just reordering the deck chairs. The structural undersupply of affordable housing is severe. Think about this. The proportion of Britons living in social housing has absolutely plummeted, from 42% in 1979 to just 16% today. And the private rental sector, which people are inevitably forced into, is often completely inadequate. The paper highlights that 1 in 3 homes in the private rented sector fail to meet decent standards, and a wild 95% of UK housing stock isn't even visitable by disabled people. So, if the current system is hitting a massive structural wall, what are the alternatives? Let's turn to Section 4, Lessons from Finland, which is one of the main case studies analyzed in the paper. There is just an incredible contrast between these two vastly different social policy philosophies. The UK relies heavily on that priority need model we talked about. In practice, this means housing is essentially treated as a conditional reward. You have to pass bureaucratic tests or engage with services first, and it relies heavily on temporary accommodation and emergency hostels. Finland? They went the opposite direction with a housing-first model. They literally abolished their hostel system entirely. Instead, housing is treated as an unconditional first step. They just provide permanent, self-contained apartments to those in need right out of the gate. And the success of this model is pretty undeniable. Finland is one of the only EU countries to consistently reduce and effectively end rough sleeping. And as the paper emphasizes, current research shows this isn't just because Finland has a smaller population than the UK. No, it is the result of a deliberate, focused policy choice based on that housing-first principle. It totally rejects the idea of housing readiness, this old notion that someone has to prove they're ready for a home. Instead, it promotes human rights and well-being by providing the secure foundation of a permanent home first, and then building the necessary support services around the individual. Okay. So, what does this massive clash in policy approaches mean for the people actually doing the work on the ground? Let's look at Section 5, Implications for Social Work Practice. At the heart of this crisis is a really deep ethical tension, what we can call the social worker's dilemma. Social workers are essentially serving as the human infrastructure managing those personalized housing plans. But because of the severe physical housing shortages, there's a huge risk of them just becoming administrative gatekeepers. The paper describes this as the managerialization of welfare. It's a situation where legal procedures and endless paperwork act as a substitute for actual physical housing. This puts frontline workers in an incredibly tough spot. They're forced to navigate a structurally regressive system while still trying to uphold their code of ethics, which strictly mandates the pursuit of social justice. The paper grounds its conclusion in this incredibly powerful quote from Means, Richards, and Smith. Housing is an essential element of community care. It's so simple, but so true. You cannot provide effective community care or empower a vulnerable person if they do not have a safe, decent place to sleep at night. Administrative tweaks and new legal duties, while they sound great in theory, are simply not enough if they aren't backed by actual physical housing stock. The source material argues that social workers must act as vocal advocates to challenge these failing policies and push for a system that views housing entirely through the lens of fundamental social justice. Which leaves us with this final vital question to ponder, based on the paper's findings.
Should housing be a conditional reward or a fundamental human right? The UK's current systemic friction and Finland's undeniable success offer two very, very different answers to that question. Understanding the underlying structure of these policies is the first step in rethinking how society actually solves its deepest systemic crises. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I'll catch you next time.